It's great to be here. Always a pleasure to come to the Iowa Pork Congress. I understand it's the last day. It's almost the end of the last day. And we're talking about a really dead issue here. So, hey. We should have plenty of time for questions, although I've got quite a few slides. Tyler Bettine asked me to talk really about three things. First of all, to kind of give a general overview of mortality disposal options, pros and cons. Secondly, to give a bit more detail specifically on composting of animal mortalities. And finally, to spend a roughly equal amount of time talking about emergency planning for catastrophic disposal, fires, ventilation failures, disease, floods like we had last year, heat exhaustion, blizzards. We've had them all in the United States in the last 5 or 6 years, including a high-path avian influenza outbreak in British Columbia in 2004. So there can be some pretty major disposal issues. I've got quite a few slides, but I think I'll try to break it up into the three parts then. A quick overview, then we'll go into the composting, and finally look at emergency. And if you have questions during the talk, ask now. Don't feel like you have to wait. If you're like me, if you wait till the end, you forget. I forget. And I think we have plenty of time. And you'll have a lot better time talking if you don't have to listen to me talk for a whole hour. So if you have questions, please try to catch my attention. Let's see here. How do we get started? Well, first thing people often ask me before you start boring us talking about rendering and burial and so forth, things that we already know. What's new? There are some new things on the horizon. Technically, three areas aimed primarily at stabilization and extended storage of carcasses prior to rendering, mostly fermentation processes, acid preservation processes, and refrigeration. And then strictly for disposal, some fairly high-tech new methods, alkaline hydrolysis, essentially high-pressure cooking in a sodium hydroxide solution in a very large hot vessel. The National Animal Disease Center has one of these. Some of the veterinary research universities around the country have them. They're quite expensive, $1 million. So it's not something that most of us would use on the farm. Some research on anaerobic digestion. Recently, some work on gasification, which is basically a two-stage incineration process. In general, these methods are fairly high on the capital cost range, higher than average for most of us on operating costs. They tend to be more complex than the methods we typically use on the farm. They might be suitable for really large operations, but for many of us, not so. Closer to home, some things that maybe are a little bit more feasible. We're starting to see mechanical composting equipment. I don't know if there's a BioVator downstairs. I'll bet there is. I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, I'd like to stop down and talk with them. But a mechanical composting, rotating barrel composting device to speed up the composting and mechanize it. At Iowa State, we've done a couple of major research projects, which Ken was kind enough to mention. Iowa DNR and USDA came to us and asked us to evaluate emergency windrow composting procedures after the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Great Britain in 2001. And we spent about 3 years doing that, looking at composting. How effective is it during winter versus summer? Which kind of materials work best? What are the environmental impacts in terms of soil pollution, air pollution? How effective, how rapidly are the carcasses decomposed? And in this case, we were specifically told to compost cattle rather than swine. So we were talking 1,000-pound carcasses. And then more recently, the Canadian government called us up and asked us to join a 3-year project with them looking at biosecure swine mortality composting, essentially composting wrapped in a plastic bag is what it boils down to, looking at how that bag affects the process and what can we do to make that process work as well as it can. So there are some new things out there, but probably not anything that you're going to pick up and use right away. The traditional methods, of course, are the ones that we're all aware of. These are not perfect solutions, obviously, but they are widely used, have been for a long time. They have historical acceptance. They're not necessarily easy, but they are relatively simple compared to some of the things I just talked about. They're timely. Most of them can be done right on the farm with the exception of rendering. And though not cheap, reasonably affordable. In 2001, ISU and Iowa Pork Producers Association did a survey of swine producers around the state, asking them how they were disposing at the time and what some of their major concerns were. This just shows that snapshot back in 2001, 8 years ago now, so I can't say that it's up to date. At that time, 36% relied solely on rendering. Let me see if I can... I guess I don't have a mouse here. I'm not sure if I can point with this or not. Yeah, I guess I can. So 36% on rendering only, 4% using incineration only, 6% that were using burial only, and roughly 12% that were using composting only. And then interestingly enough, we saw a lot of combinations: render and bury, 17%, render and incinerate, 7%, render and compost, 6%, trying to cover the contingencies across the full spectrum of weather conditions that we see here in Iowa. I'd like to redo that survey. If we could do it now, I think it would be very interesting. Now getting into what I was really asked to talk about by Tyler is looking at some of the pros and cons of the various methods. And one of the things we learned when we interviewed producers back in 2001, we asked them, what are important to you? And they said, time delays. They said, biosecurity risks. They said, environmental risks. We're seeing more pressure there. And, of course, cost. And that's not in any particular priority order. So what I'm going to do here in the next few minutes is step through each of those concerns and look at each of the four major methods and just talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons within each of these concerns. So if we look at time delays and we look at rendering, the picture that really explains the whole situation is this little graph over here of the number of rendering plants in Iowa back in 1983, 26, 1999, 7, 2006, 5 major plants. That tells the story pretty well. Fewer plants means they're farther apart. Farther apart means greater haul distances. Greater haul distances generally tend to lead to less timely pickups. And that led to a lot of frustration and comments by producers about lack of availability and lack of timeliness of rendering. And timeliness is very difficult to deal with as far as working with the rendering industry. They do their best. Iowa is extremely lucky to have 5 major plants serving the state. 5 or 6 major states in the New England area of the United States are all served by one plant. One and only one plant. We're really lucky that we have 5 or 6 that we can call on. But still, problems. Time delays related to burial are mostly weather related, either frozen soil, if I can find my arrow here, either frozen soil or muddy conditions. And the obvious practical answer there is to pre-construct the, I'm having a hard time finding the arrow here, pre-construct during warm and dry weather and locate your burial sites in dry areas on your property if you can. Try to avoid those kinds of delays. Incineration delays are pretty much related to the fixed capacity of the units. You can't just change the capacity of an incinerator. And so you buy a capacity that fits your normal mortality rate, because you don't want to buy one that's bigger than necessary. And then if you have a sudden surge in mortalities, you're not going to be able to get them through that fixed capacity incinerator. And the tendency is to want to cram them through faster. And as you add carcasses too fast to the incinerator, what happens to the temperature inside the incinerator? How many of you out here have had experience with this? How many of you incinerate? Nah, not too many. Tells you something. Well, as you add carcasses too rapidly, the internal temperature goes down. And when the internal temperature drops, you get incomplete combustion. And when you get incomplete combustion, you get odor. So there's the problem. You certainly don't want to be pushing your incinerator too hard. And so you really need to partner your incineration along with some other method, composting or rendering, to help out during periods when you have higher than normal losses. Bin composting, and we'll talk about composting options in a few minutes, but I'm going to talk mainly about bin composting. The primary cause there of time delays is, again, that you may have a fixed capacity in terms of your bin system. And so if you do have a surge in mortalities, then you're going to have to find some way to extend that. During good weather, during the summer, when it's warm and not too rainy, it's fairly easy to add some open piles. Windrows work the best rather than just static piles. And you can use that to extend your capacity. How about biosecurity? If we look at rendering, the biosecurity of the rendering process itself is very good. It's a high temperature process. However, movement of the rendering trucks from farm to farm has long been a concern for producers. I often wondered whether there's any reality to that concern. It makes sense that there might be additional risks as a truck moves from farm to farm, but do you really see that much of a problem? Recently, finally, a scientific report published in the Journal of American Veterinary Medical Association back in 2004 was not relevant to swine. It was relevant to avian influenza in the poultry industry out in Virginia. But there they did a survey and did come up with a statistical relationship between the rate of disease transmission from farm to farm, and they tied that back to rendering trucks, they felt. Not a lot of scientific evidence there, but a little. The main practical management that's been done, of course, has been simply to keep the rendering truck away from the production barns. Obvious solution there. Burial. Usually we think out of sight, out of mind. You bury it deep enough, it's going to be pretty biosecure. And that's true, but there are a couple of studies recently. 1996, Davies and Ray found a cattle burial site that was too near a stream and found that the pathogens did actually migrate through the soil and get into the stream. And anthrax spores have a very, very long-term survival in soil. And there's also a fairly famous study by Turnbull showing that anthrax spores somehow managed to migrate up through the soil from the burial zone from these cattle. So management practice-wise, burying very promptly is an important concern. Whoops, didn't want to do that. And staying away from streams. And I've gotten out of sequence here. Okay. Too far. You know, I seem to have lost track here. There we go. Oh, different than my computer. Okay, we'll go the other way. Okay. Rendering, burial. Okay, incineration. Obviously very low biosecurity risk of the incineration process itself. Very high heat there, killing pathogens. Again, if there's any risk at all, it's in the transport process between where the animal dies and getting it to the incinerator. Composting. Moderately low risk. Had good experience in the poultry industry and the swine industry in the last 15 to 20 years. But not perfect. Yeah, composting produces heat. But if you look at temperature profiles in composting piles, you'll find that there are hot zones and cool zones. And so because the heating is not uniform, there is some potential for pathogen survival or pathogen regrowth. And this happens not only in mortality composting, it happens in municipal composting of sewage sludge, for example, too. So it's a concern. The main answer here is to avoid the use of small bins or piles that are less than 1 meter in any dimension have a tendency to lose heat very rapidly. And so you may not have a very good heat treatment in a small pile, particularly during cold weather. And keeping the carcasses away from the edge of the bin or the pile. Again, if you look at a transect of a pile, you look at the temperature profile across the pile, you'll usually see a hot core, and then it cools off as you move toward the edge. And so a good strategy is to load those carcasses into that hot core and don't put them next to the edge of the pile or next to the bin, edge of the bin, or the bin wall. Rendering, not very, well, little or no significant air or water pollution risk on the farm since you're taking the carcass away from the farm, but occasional complaints. Des Moines, the rendering plant in Des Moines is an example. I know over the years they've gotten complaints from surrounding residences about air pollution around the plant. Environmental risks for burial basically focused on nitrogen pollution. Every 1,000 pounds of carcasses contains roughly 20 to 22 pounds of nitrogen, organic nitrogen in that carcass. The carcasses are roughly 75% water and fat and 25% meat and bone. The meat and bone is about 55% protein, and the protein is about 16% nitrogen. So if you do the math, take 1,000 pounds, you end up with roughly 20 or 22 pounds of nitrogen in 1,000 pounds of carcass. If you start piling carcasses really close together or on top of each other in a burial trench, you can get some exceedingly high nitrogen application rates, more than 20,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, admittedly, most of these burial sites aren't an acre large. It's just a small part of an acre. But the loading rate in that small part is very hot. It's very high. And that pollution can hang on for a decade or longer, depending on the hydrology of the site. So you certainly don't want to be putting high-density burial in places that have shallow groundwater. You certainly don't want them in places next to a well, or a stream, for that matter, either. Environmental risks for incineration, mostly air pollution related, mostly related to incinerators, as I said earlier, that are loaded too heavily. Just avoiding overloading incinerators, use them the way they were intended to be used, not that much of a problem. Environmental risks from composting, there is a soil pollution risk if you compost directly on bare soil. In fact, we've just published an article in the Journal of Water, Air, and Soil Pollution looking at the soil pollution underneath some emergency windrowing composting operations for cattle. And this is the same research we did for the Iowa DNR. In most cases, we don't compost on bare soil. Anybody that's serious about composting year-round is going to do it on a slab, a compacted gravel pad, something like that. They're not going to do it on bare soil because of the poor traction, poor terrain, problems in wet weather, so on and so forth. But in an emergency, you probably are going to have to compost on bare soil. And there you can get some pollution. Most of we found it in the top 3 feet or less, but some pretty high nitrogen loading rates, particularly ammonia nitrogen in the top foot of soil. So high, in fact, that when we tried to no-till soybeans into the soil the year after composting, the soybeans didn't emerge. There was that much ammonia nitrogen in the soil. Finally, cost. We did try to do a real close cost accounting back in 2001. A lot of people didn't believe our results because they were kind of angry at the rendering industry. The rendering bills had gone up, 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 and I think they wanted ISU to tell them that rendering was too expensive. When we did a very careful cost accounting of all the other 3 methods, and looked at the time that goes into incineration and burial and composting, and charged off that time at so many dollars an hour, and charged off the cost of the skid loader at so many dollars an hour, and looked at the fuel, and looked at the cost of buying some of this equipment, well, turned out that rendering was a lower cost option on our study than the others. And we were surprised as any, but we worked with William Edwards over in Econ. We did our estimates as carefully as we could, and that's what we got. So, that is kind of the pros and cons, looking at timeliness, environmental impact, cost, biosecurity. Before we move on into talking about composting, then, what did I leave out? Comments? Clearly, I didn't cover everything. Anybody out there saying, yeah, but you didn't think about, or you didn't mention, yeah, okay, great, thanks.
I think rendering has gone up since that's 2001.
Oh.
You have to feel for that.
I'm just assuming that it's had to go up in consideration of fuel prices and so forth, but I don't have any data. I would love to have the opportunity to redo this survey now. And I've talked a little bit with Tyler about whether there might be an opportunity to partner again with IPPA to redo this survey. Would there be any support for that? I mean, how do you, or is it worth it? I mean, it's not like it's going to change anything. It's not going to change the cost. Yeah. What? Really? Okay, I had not heard that. So they're converting to a biofuel, converting the fat to a biofuel. Is that what you're saying, or do you know what they were doing with it? I don't know. Oh. Huh. I had not heard that. Ken.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of you here, but you're going to talk about with some of these issues, with some of them you have some road issues or things getting into them.
Particularly in composting. Yeah, I will talk about it there. You bet. Yeah. Good point. I will get there on that. But however, when we surveyed 2,400 producers around the state. This is strictly a male survey, so you're lucky if you get a 20% return on a male survey. We got 400 surveys back out of 2,400 sent out, which we thought was quite good. A very good response from the industry. Out of the 400 that sent back responses, 100 of them said, we've gone out of business in the last year. So we were down to 300 around the state that these numbers are based on. Of those who were doing composting at the time, composting had the highest satisfaction level amongst producers of any of the methods. So even with rodent issues, Ken, they still saw composting in a very favorable light.
Why do you think that had the highest? I would think maybe red would have.
The way it read to me, and I suppose other people might read it differently, was I think the main thing that came through to me was I've got this under my control. I don't have to call anybody. I don't have to wait. I got my bins ready. I walk out to the barn. I've got some dead stock. Doesn't matter summer, winter, fall. Doesn't matter whether it's piglets, afterbirth, or sows. I know how I'm going to handle it. I think they really liked the flexibility and the fact that for once they had something under their control. That's the way I read it. And some of them commented to that extent. Okay, composting itself, since it's the newer method, one that requires some skill, more skill than burial, probably more skill than certainly rendering, and probably more skill than incineration. Takes a longer time, produces an end product that has to be dealt with, doesn't just turn into air. You still end up with compost that you've got to do something with. So, more management. The equipment, pretty simple. Things that most farms have, a skid loader or a tractor loader to haul carcasses, turn piles, a manure spreader to spread that compost out on cropland after you're done. And I recommend, too, a long stem dial type composting thermometer that you can poke into the pile and read temperatures 3 or 4 foot down into the pile. That can be very useful in troubleshooting if you start to have problems with your composting.
If you do have a problem, don't you find that most of the time it's temperature related? So is that your single best tool?
It is not the whole picture, but an awful lot of the things that go wrong ultimately end up reflecting in temperature. Sometimes it's not that the temperature itself is the problem, but the problem is caused, the main problem caused in composting is too much moisture. And too much moisture can cause temperatures to go down. Okay, so it's that kind of relationship, Ken. The options are pretty simple here for most on-farm composting, unless you're getting into the BioVator or something that's highly mechanized. It's usually bins versus open windrows or piles in terms of configuration, and it's usually roofed versus unroofed or unprotected. A lot of producers say, well, why would I want to spend the time building a bin and putting a roof over it? That takes money. Well, roof bins is what I recommend for Iowa for 2 reasons. First, why bins? Well, they reduce the amount of cover material that you need. It holds things together better. It helps to retain heat in cold weather, and that's important for pathogen reduction and consistent degradation. And it reduces problems with rodents and scavengers. It doesn't eliminate the problem, but it makes it harder. It makes it harder for rodents and scavengers to get in there. And I'll say a little bit more about them even later. Why a roof? Average rainfall or average precip, not just rainfall, total precip for the year, 32 inches a year in Iowa. We're a pretty humid state. And as I just indicated to Ken, probably the main problem that we see with composting is caused by too much water. And so putting a roof over it is a way to reduce leachate, it's a way to reduce odors, it's a way to guard against low internal temperatures, and it's a way to guard against slow decomposition of the pigs. So a roof, yeah, it's extra cost, it's extra work to get it, but I think it pays off in far fewer problems for the operator. Facilities can look pretty fancy, like this one, which is at the Bilsland Swine Research Center at Iowa State. This one was built totally by contracted staff. It was not built by the farm manager and the farm staff. It was all new concrete, all new materials, $16,000. Pretty pricey. They don't have to be that expensive. Here's one that was built on one of our outlying research farms, built on an existing feeding slab that was already there, using, instead of concrete, treated lumber. Much cheaper construction, much simpler, much lower cost. And here's some nice photos. My cohort, Chris Cole, Extension Ag Engineer up in northwest Iowa, sent me these of a composting operation in an existing cattle loafing shed. Hardly cost the producer anything at all to put that facility together. Obviously, it's not very large, but it met his needs at a very low cost. You don't necessarily have to build something new at all. Estimating the total bin space needed is really pretty doggone simple. You take your total annual pounds of loss based on your records, divide by 365 to get an average loss per day, an average number of pounds of loss per day for your operation. And then you multiply by 40. So if you had 100 pounds of loss per day for your operation, you'd need 40 times 100 or 4,000 cubic feet of composting space. Okay? That would be your total, all of your bins together. Okay. Now what about the bin dimensions themselves? Very practical. The width is usually twice the width of whatever your loader width is. If you make the bins too narrow, you're going to end up tearing up your loader or tearing up your walls, one or the other, because everybody gets in a hurry trying to load these bins. And so making the width twice the bucket width just makes good sense. So if you've got a skid loader with a 5-foot bucket, make your bin 10 foot across. And then the length from front to back is usually 1 to 2 times the width. So it could be square, it could be rectangular. So if we had a 5-foot bucket, then a typical bin might be 10 foot across, 15 foot front to back. We rarely make them more than 6 foot high, and we generally only load 5 foot high. So the total loaded bin volume is the width times the length times the 5 foot height. So again, if we had a 10 foot wide by 15 foot long bin loaded to a depth of 5 feet, that would be 750 cubic feet for one bin. We needed 4,000 cubic feet for my little example a few minutes ago. So it would take about 6 bins to get your 4,000 cubic feet if they were this size. Very simple approach. And you don't need to write this down. It's all in a bulletin called Composting Swine Mortalities in Iowa, PM 1917. And that's also referenced in this PowerPoint presentation. So you divide the total bin volume by the volume per bin. If you come up with an odd number, you usually add 1 because it's nice to have an even number of bins, because generally you load a bin and about halfway through the process you use your skid loader and move that material to what we call a secondary bin. So you really need an even number of bins. And then if you need space for storing your cover material, whether it be wood chips, ground corn stalks, ground straw, whatever, you want to keep that cover material dry. You don't want that sitting out and getting too wet, or it can lead to some problems we'll talk about here in a minute. So you may need to add a couple of extra bins just for cover material storage, or put that cover material in a nearby building. But keep it out of the rain. We don't need to talk about that. Okay, the actual process. If you want to get down and dirty and talk about it from a microbiological standpoint, we could spend all day talking about the kinds of microbes and all of their requirements. And I don't think that's what we need to be here to talk about today. But that's where the action takes place, and it is doggone near miraculous. I mean, I have had, during warm weather composting research trials, 1,000-pound cattle carcasses reduced to nothing but bones in about 100 days. That is pretty darn remarkable. Now, in cold weather, if you start out in cold weather, then that same 1,000-pound carcasses may take 8 to 10 months. But during warm weather, so it's very weather dependent. What are we really trying to do? Well, pretty simple, actually. We have a bin. We put an absorptive layer of material in the bottom. We put in a layer of carcasses. We add the same base material over the top of the carcasses, then add another layer. Do the same thing until we get up to about 5-foot depth. The important things are to maintain a buffer around the walls and over the top. This is that insulating barrier that I talked about just a few minutes. You want to stay in this hot zone that's in the middle. You don't want to get these carcasses too close to the edge, or you may end up with some juicy stuff running out through the walls of the bin. Not good. And you will have slower decay over here as well. You want to use a material that is gas permeable. It lets oxygen in, oxygen going down into the pile, and it lets excess water vapor and decomposition gases out. And if this material is too tight, it will stop the process or seriously slow it down. Turns out that wood chips, I mean anything that kind of looks like that photo up there in the upper left, I've thrown a quarter in there, but that happens to be a wood chip mix. You can see pore spaces between those wood chip particles. Ground corn stalks. If you grind up corn stalks and you just run it through a tub grinder with a 2-inch screen, it's very porous. It's very light and fluffy. It lets air move through very easily. It lets water vapor move out very quickly. And then, really important is you want a moist zone around the carcasses. How do you get that moist? How does that get moist? Huh? Bingo, right. animal, 1,000 pounds of carcasses contains 650 pounds of water. They're 65% water. You don't have to add water usually unless you hit a really dry season. And then you may have to add some water. But on the flip side of that, let's say we crowd these carcasses together. And notice they're not touching each other. There's space around it. There's an envelope around each of these carcasses to soak up that water so that it doesn't leach out the bottom. What if we cram twice as many carcasses in there? Then what happens? It stops composting. It gets very wet. You've added too much water, as he said. You start leaching. As this material gets overly wet and saturated, oxygen can't get in any longer because the pore spaces are filled up with water. So then it goes anaerobic on you, and anaerobic decomposition is much slower and smellier than aerobic decomposition. So it's really important to have enough of this material around the animals to kind of soak up that excess moisture, not let it become saturated. It's important to have enough of this along the sides and over the top to serve as insulation. And actually, this moist zone over the top is pretty good at capturing odorous gases, and microbes will live in that zone over the cap and help to break down those odorous gases as well. So that's the process. That's the process. It's pretty forgiving as long as we don't overload the bin, as long as we don't put the carcasses too close together, as long as we use a material that is fairly open and porous and gas permeable. So use plenty of envelope material. The failures that I get calls about are usually people trying to pack too many carcasses into too small a space. And I really I've given you some inch measurements here, but my rule of thumb is the material thickness that you put between layers should be as thick as the thickness of the animal. So if you've got piglets in a layer, then you don't need much material over the top of them before you put the next layer. But if you've got breeding stock that are, a foot thick, then you need a foot thick of material above and below that. Okay?
No matter what material you use.
It sure does matter, but we're fortunate in that, the poultry industry started mortality composting. It was the broiler industry and the turkey industry. And of course, on the floor of broiler barns and turkey barns, what do they have? Wood shavings with turkey manure in it. And that stuff is really hot, and it composts great. It builds up a lot of heat. And so what a great thing to put around carcasses, because it just heats instantly. Swine, not so easy. Most swine producers have water coming into the barn and feed and liquid manure going out, not that much bedding. And so what do you use? And in our early research, we paid for wood shavings, just like the poultry industry did. And that got way too expensive, because it's really pricey to buy wood product in Iowa. And we soon quit and started grinding corn stalks. They're not quite as good for a variety of reasons, but they work. Since then, in our research for the Canadian government, we've used, and for DNR, we've used corn silage. Of course, you wouldn't use corn silage for a routine disposal, but in a catastrophic situation where all of your cattle are dead anyway, and the silage is probably contaminated, you would use the silage. We've used corn silage, we've used soybean straw, ground soybean straw, ground corn stalks, ground oat straw, wood shavings, peanut hulls, rice hulls. A lot of different things are used around the United States, but they all have this permeability, this porous characteristic. John Newton at the Billsland Farm using his 4-foot-long long stem thermometer. You see John got a measurement there of about 140 degrees, fairly hot. US EPA standards for pathogen reduction call for about 135 degrees for at least 3 consecutive days. And we usually get that very easily in the core of the pile. If you poke this same pile near the edge, it's not going to be that hot. So again, keep the carcasses in the middle. And occasionally there'll be a dry zone that just doesn't get moist. No microbial activity if it's too dry. And occasionally there'll be an overly wet zone. Again, not very much activity if it's overly wet. And so that's why poking this pile with a compost thermometer kind of gives you a good feeling about how things are going on the inside. As I said to Ken, it doesn't necessarily mean that the temperature is the problem, but the temperature is an indicator of a problem, either too wet, too dry, or too close to the edge. Turning. Do you have to turn? No. You do not have to turn. What does turning do? It mixes wet material with dry material, and so generally it speeds up the whole process. But do you have to turn? No. In 3 years of research for Iowa DNR, we composted 54 tons of 1,000-pound cattle, both summer, winter, and spring. We never turned any of the piles. Would they have gone faster if we'd have turned them? Sure. Of course they would have. But in an emergency, would you have time to turn them? Probably not. Why would you turn for routine mortality composting on the swine farm? Probably because you don't want to build more bins. You want more material to get through those bins, and so turning pays off with fewer bins because it speeds it up.
Does turning allow you to reuse your material?
Yes, yes. Although it's usually the end product that you reuse. But a lot of farmers do save money by taking some of their finished compost and using that as cover material for a subsequent batch. And you can do that 3 or 4 times, and then at that point it kind of starts to quit working because the chemical composition has changed enough, having used it 3 or 4 times. You've lost most of your carbon. There's not as much nutrient there, and it kind of loses its punch if you do it too much. But yes, you can reuse it. A lot of farmers do. When you get done, you've got to get rid of the compost. The volume reduction is usually, at least 50%. If you start out with a pile that's 5 foot tall, it'll usually be 2 foot tall when you get done. But you've got to do something with it. Iowa DNR does allow mortality compost to be applied to bulk cropland and even to pastures, by the way. If you put it somewhere else, you've got to ask DNR for permission to do that. The N and P in bin compost, the way we've been talking about it, is usually pretty miserably low. Probably 0.5% or a little bit higher of total N and total P on a wet basis. Because there is so much corn stalk or so much wood shaving in there or so much oat straw, and those materials have hardly any N in them at all. They're almost all carbon. So the mixture, yeah, there's a lot of N in the carcasses. We've talked about that. But by the time you dilute all that N with all that material that has hardly any N and P in it to begin with, it's not a fertilizer. Not a very good fertilizer. Now, I suspect that maybe equipment like the BioVator, which I've had no experience with, although I built a research unit that was very similar, probably much richer because you would need less cover material because of this constant turning. And I suspect that the nutrient content of their product may be considerably better, although I don't know for sure. But it seems reasonable that it would. Some troubleshooting. The main problems then that I see are leachate production, poor odor retention, slow carcass decay. We've really been over the logic of these already. If we've got leachate, excess precipitation is the first problem. A roof solves that, or a tarp or something will solve that excess precipitation and the resulting saturation. Inadequate liquid absorption capacity gets back to putting too many carcasses too close together. You're packing too much water in too small an area. There's not enough sorptive material around each carcass to soak up that liquid. It gets very wet. Oxygen can't get in. The process slows down. It goes anaerobic. You get odor. Or use of envelope material that's stored outdoors and got wet before you even used it. You had the grinder truck come in and grind a big pile of it and just left it outdoors. Not such a good idea last June. Poor odor. Oftentimes the amount of envelope material placed over the carcasses is either too thin or too coarse, one or the other, and you will get some odor in either case. Too coarse, particularly for corn stalks, means it hasn't been ground up enough. And a real example of that, about 3 years ago, Iowa DNR called me. 150 full-grown cattle in southwest Iowa had been maliciously poisoned. And suddenly this farmer was faced with 150 cattle to get rid of. And he called DNR. He said, what do I do? And they kind of thought about rendering and looked at the cost and didn't really want to do that. And DNR said, well, ISU has had good luck composting cattle carcasses in ground corn stalks. Why don't you try that? Well, the guy was stressed out, I'm sure. And he didn't use ground corn stalks. He used whole corn stalks. He just rolled out bales and laid them on. Well, that's way too porous, way too open. And the odor around there was outstanding. It was really something. There was a fence about 50 feet away that was just crawling with flies. The odor was that bad, the fence 50 feet away was crawling with flies. And then they went in and tried to put straw over the top of it to hold the odor in. And that didn't work very well either. So you want to grind the material to begin with. Compost turned prematurely. Some particularly new people that are new to composting get kind of enthused about turning that compost soon. And if you turn it too soon, you really haven't cooked that meat enough, and it can be pretty smelly. And then once you've exposed it, then you're forced to find more cover material to cover it up to staunch the odor, to hold it back in. So it's very wasteful of your time and wasteful of your cover material. So you want to, be at least halfway through the decomposition process. Admittedly, there'll still be some soft tissue there, but it'll be pretty well cooked halfway through the decomposition process, and the odor potential is much lower. But turning too soon or during cold weather can be a problem. Poor odor retention when the compost is too wet. We've already talked about that. The saturation, the anaerobic process. We've been through that. Finally, slow decay. Oftentimes due to inadequate oxygen penetration of the pile. If the cover material you use is too tight, if it's too much like soil, if it looks a lot like soil with really tiny little spaces between the particles, not so good. We actually used this material on the left in some research that we did. It was Iowa State University yard waste compost. It had a very, very fine texture. After a year of composting cattle in that, we had to break the pile apart with a backhoe. It stunk like crazy, and mix it with corn stalks and recompost it for another 6 months because it was too tight. The partner piles that were started at the same time using corn stalks and silage were done in 6 months. This pile was just way too tight. Not enough oxygen moving in, not enough excess moisture moving out. Another reason for inadequate O2 is excessive moisture. We've already talked about that. Not just because the envelope material is too tight, but because it's too wet. And when the material becomes too wet, the pore spaces that would normally allow oxygen into the pile get filled up with water. Oh, and sometimes, not very often in Iowa, but in California and western Oklahoma and Texas, where they do a lot of composting, they do need to add water because it is so dry. Their climate is so dry that the material just never gets moist enough. We talked about the essential moisture level. You need something that's 45 to 60% moisture, or your microbes dry out and starve to death. Microbes need water just like you and I do. And low temperature caused either by inadequate heat production or retention. Again, that would either be due to too dryness or the pile that's too small. I was at a community college in northeast Iowa, and they were trying to demonstrate composting of a dairy calf. And it was just one calf and one very small pile. And they had done everything right, except the pile was just too small. And when the pile is too small, heat just leaves too quickly. And they could never get it hot enough because the pile itself is just too small. Comment about the composting process then. We're done with that. Yep, I think. Okay. It takes a huge amount of heat energy to thaw water. And remember, that carcass is 65% water. So once it's frozen, you waste all of your heat buildup trying to thaw water before you can even start to decompose the carcass. So yeah, putting a frozen carcass in a pile is usually not very good unless the pile is very large and just has a huge capacity to generate heat. Some materials do. Again, the poultry litter. Boy, that stuff gets hot fast. Corn silage gets hot very fast, produces a lot of heat because it's already partially decayed by the fermentation process. They would probably produce enough heat to actually thaw out a carcass. But corn stalks or ground straw, that carcass is going to stay frozen until next June. What did we used to do before we had refrigerators? We harvested ice off of lakes and buried it in sawdust as an insulator. And it would last, through the summer. Yeah, don't let them freeze. Not usually very good. Sometimes they can work. Other comments about the composting process? Yeah. Oh yes, yeah. We asked them, how much time did you spend? And then we allocated an average farm labor cost to that time. But we allocated it to cutting a trench for burial. We allocated it to working in composting. We allocated it to feeding an incinerator. We tried to be very consistent about it. As far as the quality of the work, Iowa DNR gets some complaints every year about composting that isn't being done correctly. On the other hand, they get complaints about burial that isn't being done correctly. Or they get complaints about incinerators that are being misused. So I don't know that the percentage of problems is necessarily any higher for composting, although it does require more know-how and more skill, more dedication than the other methods, in my opinion at least. Okay, one last shot here looking at emergency livestock disposal planning. We've been pretty lucky in Iowa. But when you consider that we're number one in egg production with 60 million laying hens in the state, we're number one in swine production, marketing, 25 to 30,000 animals a year. We're about number 6 or 7 in beef cattle production. And we've got a moderately good dairy herd population as well. We've got a huge population of birds and animals in Iowa. And we really need to start thinking, what would we do if we had a foot and mouth outbreak like Great Britain had? And even the simple stuff. Every year we hear about fires, ventilation failures, roof collapses due to too much snow or wind, flooding. There are a lot of pigs that ended up on top of the levees along the Mississippi River last year, although it wasn't as bad as it could have been. We've had major blizzards in the Midwest. Texas had a major wildfire in the spring of 2006 in North Texas that killed a huge amount of cattle. California has had 2 very hot summers where they've lost more dairy cattle in 1 month than they normally lose in a year due to heat exhaustion. And then we've got the disease issues. We've had avian influenza outbreaks in Virginia, but they've been low path. Virginia, and I think Maryland as well. There was a high pathogenic avian influenza outbreak in British Columbia in 2004. Very serious. So we not only have the on-farm local problem to worry about, the individual thing that might happen to us individually, but what if we had some sort of regional problem, like flooding? The thing I see is that we're not doing enough planning for these, and to push this along, when the catastrophe happens, time becomes very short, very critical. It's easy to make mistakes, like the guy that didn't grind the corn stalks because he was stressed out. What was he going to do with 150 cattle? And yet, rapid containment of the carcasses becomes really essential to cut down on biosecurity issues, to cut down on odor, to cut down on soil and water pollution. So you've got to do something pretty fast, particularly in warm weather. Pre-planning can hopefully help to avoid some hasty decisions where you've overlooked options, or worse yet, where you've made some incorrect assumptions. And here are some assumptions that I think a lot of people sometimes make. I can always send them to the landfill. I don't know how many of you have checked with your local landfill, but I would urge you to do it. Most small landfills do not accept carcasses. They don't have the equipment or enough cover material for them to do it. And if there's any human disease risk, they're probably going to not let you in either. In fact, in British Columbia in 2004, the province of British Columbia, their main plan for disease control was to dispose of poultry in landfills. And when the landfill operators discovered that avian influenza was transmissible to humans, they locked their gates and said, no, we're not taking them. I can always bury them on the farm. Not always, no. Emergency approval of catastrophic mortalities requires prior approval by Iowa DNR. And Iowa DNR has put a burial zone map on the web. You can go and find your farm on this map. If you're in one of these pink zones, and there's a lot of pink, about 30% of Iowa is pink because it's too close to bedrock, too close to streams, too close to shallow groundwater. If it's in a pink zone, DNR is probably not going to let you do a large-scale burial in that area. I can always bury them on my farm. You know, my point here is, even if emergency burial is approved, what about the nitrogen issue we talked about? When you start putting pigs in a trench and piling them on top of each other like this, you're going to get very hot nitrogen zones. Again, more than 20,000 pounds per acre on a unit basis. I can always burn them. I can just pile up some wood and throw them on top and burn them. They tried that in Great Britain in 2001. See all the smoke? Very famous photo. After about a month of that, the British government stepped in and said, no, you can't do that anymore. The air pollution was horrific. The odor was horrific. The public reaction was horrific to it. You can use air curtain incinerators. That's what's in the right-hand photo there. Very clean burn, very high temperature. Do a nice job. Do we have a lot of air curtain incinerators in Iowa? No. Some states are buying them and strategically locating them around their states. You can always take them to the rendering plant. Well, the rendering plant will try to help you out if they have capacity and if they're not too far away. But that isn't always the case. I can always compost them. In an emergency, we can build a big, long windrow like Iowa State did, and we can compost them in an emergency. Yeah, but it requires a heck of a lot of cover material. 8 to 12 cubic yards of cover material for every 1,000 pounds of carcasses is what it cost us. That's a lot of material. So that means you need, if you're really sincere about using composting for emergency disposal, you better be stockpiling stalks or straw or something, because it's not going to be easy to get that much material just like that. So, an emergency disposal plan makes some sense. I guess one of my questions would be to discuss with you when we get done with this is there something Iowa State can help with to urge this issue along? Because if you do it in advance, you can consider all the options at your leisure. You can collect the important record-keeping information that you need, phone numbers, addresses, these sorts of things. You can identify service providers, and you can get it documented on paper so that your employees know what your plan is. So if you plan on rendering in an emergency, you better be talking with your closest renderer. What is their policy going to be? What are their charges going to be? Who's going to handle the transport? They may not be willing to break their trucks loose to haul your animals because they need their trucks to haul their normal business. If you think you can use landfilling, then you better be talking to your local landfill. This discussion has come up just recently because in the cattle industry, there's going to be a new policy going into effect here about disposing of animals that are more than 30 months of age. It's relevant to mad cow disease. And it means that renderers are not going to want to take these old cattle. And it means that they need to go somewhere else. And DNR had a meeting to talk with the renderers and to talk with the landfill people, and a lot of the landfill people said, we're not set up for this. We're not set up for this. Incineration, you're not going to use your on-farm incinerator, obviously, in an emergency. Just not big enough. You're going to really, DNR is not going to let you use an open pyre due to air quality considerations. You're going to have to contract with an emergency contractor that has air curtain incineration equipment. And there are companies around the U.S. that do this for a variety of reasons. But it'll take a few days for them to get here. On-farm burial, if you're going to do that, you really ought to be talking with DNR geologists and finding out where your farm is on the burial zone map and finding if you even have an area on your map that's suitable for mass burial. The state of Kansas very proactively took some EPA money and went around to all of the major cattle producers and hog producers in Kansas and sat down with them across the table and said, okay, if you have to dispose of your herd tomorrow, we're going to figure out where on your farm you could bury them. And they made that decision up front. And I think that was a very proactive thing to do. Not that I'm necessarily in favor of burial, but if you have to do it, let's do it in the right place at least. So you need to look at that burial zone map. You need to check records for underground utilities in the area. Yeah, I think many of you know if you even put a shovel in the ground in the state of Iowa, you're supposed to call Iowa One Call so that they can locate utilities. If you happen to hit a utility with your backhoe or your shovel, you'll end up paying for the repair of that utility because you didn't call Iowa One Call. Yeah, obviously got to have an earth-moving contractor. And if you're going to compost, you better be out there in the fall baling stalks and putting those up behind the grove. And I see a lot of farms that do that anyway for bedding. I mean, you see huge piles of corn stalks baled and stacked. And the quality of these corn stalks doesn't have to be particularly high for composting. You're not feeding it. You're really not using it for a bedding either. If they're slightly weathered and slightly rotten, that's not a huge deal, frankly. They don't have to be top-notch. Ken?
You got really big animals, mature cattle, old sows and boars. Does it help them up?
Sure. Yeah. In fact, there's a company out in eastern Colorado that grinds whole cattle carcasses and composts them that way. But it takes a 500 horsepower grinder to do it.
So what kind of, I noticed in one picture you have people that I know that use composting. The biggest problem they have is big bones.
Yeah.
You know, everything else is gone.
Yeah.
They go to put out some compost around mother's flowers.
Yeah.
And some bones, and that's
Yeah.
a little trouble for that.
Yeah, it is. Grinding won't necessarily, or cutting them up won't necessarily solve that. Grinding would, but very expensive, very time consuming, not something you could do in an emergency.
Cost efficient, in your opinion?
No, and most, even for routine, most farmers don't want to get into that. Too dangerous, too time consuming. Well, the benefits, I think, are obvious. I don't need to read this to you. You need to put your plan in writing because your employees need to know what your plan is. And, you know, in an emergency like this, things are going to go wrong. And some neighbors may not like what has to happen. But at least if you show you have a written plan, it shows a good faith effort to do the right thing. And regardless of whether things went perfect or not, you've got that plan. You can say, look, we had this plan. We were trying to do the right thing. It didn't all go perfect. There it is in writing. That can help. So that good faith effort is important. You need a plan B, particularly if plan A doesn't work as usual. And if it's a barn fire or something like that, plan A is probably going to work. But if it's a regional death loss due to regional flooding, then your plan A may be wiped out. And it would be really smart to have a plan B as well. You can get help from the DNR. Somewhere in here, Ken, you had asked about, where did my little photo go? I don't think maybe I lost that. Oh, yeah, I went right by it. Finished compost will contain bones. They'll be nice and dry and free of tissues. And the problem is that some scavengers, here's mine, I had a partially consumed frozen pheasant outside my garage this morning. Now, any decent scavenger with a shred of decency, if they steal something, they haul it off to the timber next to the field, or they don't bring it back and put it on your doorstep or on your neighbor's doorstep. So, yeah, the bone scavenger thing is an issue. You certainly don't want to be spreading those bones next to habitation. Might make your neighbors a little bit upset with you.